essentially, data autonomy is the capacity of a person or a group to make meaningful decisions about their data. And yeah, why this debate in the first place? Why do we do research on this? So this is something which, where on the one hand, I have a very recent interest in, but also where I have a very long-term interest in. The very long-term interest is what I'm going to start with today. That is this idea of reconceptualization of privacy. And when I talk about privacy, my background predominantly stems from international and European human rights law. So that is also why I focus predominantly on legal takes, but there is also a lot of emerging concepts out there, which from different disciplines, from social sciences, from political sciences, from all types of takes, and I find them very, very inspiring. Then there is another issue which is connected to something which I do for a bit longer, internet governance, and specifically the concept of digital sovereignty, which is becoming more and more influential in a way in internet governance. And then the last point, but I'm only hinting to this, and we already heard today much more about this, is this idea that these principles can eventually inform how we design systems. So, or for instance, a smart city project, so how we set that up. But let's start with the reconceptualization of privacy. And this is based on a paper I wrote together with a colleague, Anne Beaulieu. And the title is How to Protect Privacy in a Datafied Society. And there first might be good to talk about what the datafied society is. And the idea here is that we are looking at this concept from datafication from a science and technology studies perspective, also based on a book which Anne recently published. And in a nutshell, I mean, you can see that here, but in a nutshell, the idea is that we do not separate the technological artifacts from the societal practices which are around it. And for instance, when I look into my domain, in the legal domain, we still have a lot of talk about digitization. So this idea, particularly when you look at it from an administrative perspective, in the past, you went to a public authority and then you've had to fill out a form. And then in the 90s, it became on the internet. So there's this digitization perspective. And from a decision-making point, the real big shift towards datafication is that it is not just essentially the same process and then on a web page or in an app, but really the data that we have to conceive decisions, to get to the perspectives and the concepts that we develop, they are essentially data, right? So that is a paradigm shift because it has a lot to do with the way how you predict with the future, how you envisage the future, and so on. It's probably not a particularly difficult sell in this environment, but yeah, in others it requires some explanation. Now, in the paper, we look into these different concepts. On the left hand, you have legal concepts, and on the right hand, you have conceptual approaches. And there are two things. So I think when it comes to the legal concepts, we have sort of two mainstream approaches, which is privacy as an individual right, which essentially dates back to the 17th century and first was formalized with the US Constitution, stemming from case law, which originally came from England. And then we have in the 1970s, this is a sort of a European thing originally, we have data protection law. And today, when we talk about the General Data Protection Regulation, which is from 2016, it's actually a very iterative, substantively very iterative development of laws, which first developed in Germany, then in Sweden, and then in the 1970s, we really had this wave of data protection laws, which in 1981 was then became part of an international convention. And 1995, you had the first data protection directive from the European Union, and in 2012, a process started, which eventually became in 2016, the GDPR. But the very important thing here is, substantively, this is very iterative, right? For instance, the principle I mentioned yesterday, purpose limitation, is already a principle which is there since the 1970s. But then there are also other legal approaches like habeas data. Does somebody know habeas data? Ever heard about it? Maybe you?
But habeas not in the concept in the realm of data. I don't know how habeas corpus. Habeas corpus.
It is related. So this is something which is very strongly politically driven in the context of South American politics, especially in the 1970s and end of the 1970s, dictatorship in Argentina, where a lot of people disappeared. And then the ideas behind habeas data is that you have sort of a constitutional rights, or the families, to find out on archives what actually happened to those people. And it spread across the continent. So you also have it in Brazil and others. And then informational self-determination, that's important when we talk about data autonomy. Anybody knows that? Yes. Right. Can you maybe say what it is?
Well, it is the ability to decide over your own data and to manage the management of the data.
Yeah. And what is really interesting here is, this is from 1983, constitutional court judgment of the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany, in response to a census which was kept in Germany at the time. And the interesting thing here is, and that is what really is important conceptually for the data autonomy discussion, is that when we talk about privacy as an individual right, then we think about bricks and mortars, doors which can be shut, right? 17th century. So the idea was the state cannot just intervene in my home without any arbitrarily, essentially, right? Data protection is much more abstract, because data protection is about the protection of personal data. So first you have to identify what is personal data. And today in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, you also have a fundamental right, not only to privacy, but to data protection. But there's always what in German is called the Schutzgutdebatte. So we don't actually, the critics say we don't actually know why we want to protect data, right? And that is partially because here it is clear that it is the private sphere, the family and so on. Here is an abstraction. This is something which happens in a political context, and then informational self-determination is rooted differently to privacy and data protection in human dignity. So it's rooted in actually Article 1 of the German Constitution, but today you could also argue it's in Article 1 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of EU. So this is the protection of human dignity, and then in the classical 1983 judgment taken together with the right to individual personal development, right? And this sounds all very academic and abstract, but this has real implications on why people perceive these rights as being legitimate. Then on the conceptual approaches side, I will not go into detail there. So data autonomy could be one of them, but what was also very interesting, which I would just like to bring a bit of attention to, is that actually when you look broader in the world, because you might ask, Oskar, why do we have these things here and not others? Well, most of this is coming from workshops that we organized in a UN setting. When I was working with the UN Special Rapporteur of Privacy, we were holding regional conferences, and then these things came up. Of course, that is a very policy-driven role, so we never had time to write it really up, but then eventually I managed to. And what was very interesting, and a very interesting line of work that is there, is indigenous conceptions of privacy and how they feed into that. So there is social research on Aboriginal camps and which type of conventions they have. Just 10 days ago or so, we had a colleague presenting at our campus who is doing ethnographic research in Micronesia on the Solomon Islands. And then also there, it is really, really interesting how their perception about who they are as an identity is much less tied to materialist artifacts than ours. So for instance, when they go on social media, they will always use fake identities so that their social media personality is not tied to theirs. And it's very, very interesting because in a way, this is much more sensitive to this idea that there is what we would now call a data trail in this environment to what I do when I interact with those non-tangible things. But what this essentially says is, so this is also not, it is not just what I'm thinking, but also a lot of this UN work. So privacy is essentially a proxy for the relationship between the individual and society, right? So that's also where you could see it's not something which we do as an end in itself, but it is something which is always a relational nature. And it also reflects its character as a non-absolute human right. So there are absolute human rights, such as, for instance, not being tortured or enslaved. But privacy really has this proxy character. And it always means it's highly context dependent. And of course, it also means when technology changes, then also our understanding of privacy has to change. This is not new at all. You can see it in history. The very classical 1890 article in the Harvard Law Review starting the US-American privacy debate was essentially, or can be understood essentially, as a consequence of two things. First of all, emerging newspapers, so that information could be distributed much more quickly, because and the second thing is like instant photography. It was much easier to take pictures. And essentially what happened, so there were, the article is called The Right to Privacy, and it was written by two judges, Warren and Brandeis. And essentially the motivation for writing this article and revisiting the right to privacy was because one of the judges had his daughter married, and there was was like a very, high stakes social event. And then they were very unhappy with the reporting and the publicity that they got out of it, which was only possible because the technological context changed. And today, of course, we talk about social media and all these types of things, right? All right, but essentially when we, legally speaking, let me start like that, we have essentially two mainstream approaches. So what we see is privacy as an individual right, which has this strong connection to physical privacy and which is therefore somehow difficult to translate in the time that we live in. Then we have data protection, which essentially today, globally speaking, is the mainstream approach, because we know from data, so there's a professor in New South Wales who runs a database, that I think 163 countries in the world have data protection laws on a national level. And most of them follow the GDPR approach. And then you must not forget, countries update their legislation. So when they remodel their laws, then they follow the GDPR approach. And I think what we have there is very solid and very important. And the problem on that level is not that the rules per se or the principles that we have are not working. It is more that they are either unknown, and especially that the enforcement is very complex. So also that what you have with the GDPR at the moment in Europe, the biggest problem is actually the capacity to enforce the law. At the same time, I think, especially from an academic perspective and looking, and thinking about the potential of the technology and also how we could develop as a society, I think actually our responsibility, while acknowledging all of these other things, is to really invest in this thinking about, so what could be future conceptual approaches look like, right? Without trying to undermine the value of privacy and autonomy, but at the same time, still there are problems with these things on a substantive level, right? But again, my overall research theme is human dignity in the digital age. So usually when you show the Elon Musks of the world this slide, right, then they will take it as an excuse to throw what we have out of the window and just be sarcastic about it. And that's not my intention. Yet still, I think there are legitimate questions, and we have to address them. And that's what I try with this work on data autonomy. So one of the big problems I already mentioned is, so why do we protect personal data, right? What makes data personal in the first place? And this is something when you actually look into GDPR, and if you look in the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of the European Union, and also the European Court of Human Rights, this is not clear, right? And I also think conceptually for a court, this is not a task that the legal systems that we have can solve. Because a court always decides on a case-to-case basis. And the decision is always relevant in that case. And that helps me, if I wait 5 years, that helps me to understand what would have been right back then. But if you're thinking about the future, then we have to tell people, so how do you design a system, right? How can you embed those things? And then you need a more holistic vision than just a case-by-case story. And you just need something more substantively to hold on to. Another big problem is data protection is very good from a legal perspective because it has the capacity to clearly identify individual rights and responsibilities, right? That is what you need for law to work, but it makes it individual. And there is also the problem that we have to sort of statically label data. So we have to decide at some point, this is personal data, this is non-personal data. We have to decide this is in the category of very sensitive personal data, not very sensitive, and so on. And if you think, all of you know that when you're thinking about algorithms, when you're thinking about complex big data sets, what is actually relevant or not, we just often don't know. And also we want to have that flexibility often, right? So that is a thing which is problematic and where a better conception could help. Then another thing, and that's the last one I'm taking from this slide, is this relationship between individuality and a community, right? So how can we engage with community interests when we are talking about these issues? As I said, the two mainstream approaches that we have at the moment, privacy and individual right and data protection, is very focused on the individual. At the same time, I think, you know, there's also this cliche that, for instance, the law is always lagging behind, the regulation is always lagging behind. I think it is also very important to challenge that notion, right? And I think there is conceptually, so we have essentially two dynamics which are reinforcing each other and really undermining the degree of privacy and autonomy that we can enjoy. And one is that the technology that we currently have is essentially forcing us to be in this or in that category, right? So it's 0 or 1, it's black or white. And at the same time, we have this idea also with the smart cities that everything is going to be datafied, right? And what it essentially means is that we're, if you think about a spectrum which is going from black to white, and where being white is being completely transparent and black is being completely anonymous, then privacy is usually what happens in between, right? So it's the gray area. And with these types of dynamics, we essentially lose the gray area. This blurry kind of relationship, which is really essential for privacy and autonomy. So Floridi has an article in 2016 about human dignity as the core of privacy, and he talks there about the polytropos. So that is a figure in ancient Greek mythology, which essentially describes a situation where something could happen, but it is not really clear what happens until the moment that it happens. So there is sort of a floating state, which is there, right? And with all of this data-driven prediction and quantifying everything, we're eliminating this. And this also means at the same time, we're losing our autonomy, we're losing our privacy. And there, I think there's also a job for the technology to somehow find ways to embed that uncertainty. And one very good space here, like in the context of the smart cities, you can, for instance, think about public space. I always find it very inspiring also in security projects, because a space being public somehow also means, so there are conventions on what is acceptable in public, but it also means there are uncertainties, right? Because it's a public space. It's not like your home where everything is controlled and so on. And what we see with smart city concepts is often that this idea of the public space and what can happen there and what not seems to be getting more and more narrow, is at least my interpretation of it. There's only a particular community it speaks to, or a particular set of people. All right, so the idea then with data autonomy is to respond to those challenges. And essentially, it is grounded on informational self-determination, but it expands this in 3 dimensions, which speaks to these new developments. So one is that informational, I don't have the time to go into this in detail, but the informational self-determination that's really typical thinking, protecting citizens during census from the government collecting data, so they must not be afraid of what the government could know about them. But it's very strongly focused between the state-citizen relationship, which is problematic for a number of reasons. So the first one is, it is focused on this idea that the state is the primary data collector and so on. And of course, today we have a lot of very powerful private corporations. So the question is, how do we get them into the picture? Then the second thing is, has to go beyond individual rights and duties, right? And the case study that I'm working on at the moment, which is, at our university, we have this project which is relating to how can we as a university get more autonomous from using big tech cloud infrastructure. In our case, that's everything is on Google, right? So how can we do this using this lens of data autonomy? But there, the main goal is the protection of academic freedom, right? And academic freedom, just look at it from a fundamental rights perspective, is actually a specialized right, version of the right to free expression. But what is interesting about academic freedom is that academic freedom has an individual dimension, which is that I as an academic can speak my mind, but it also has an institutional dimension, right? So the institution that I work for has to have the capacity to give people an environment where they can think and speak freely. So it is not done by solving the individual problem. And then the last thing is this static labeling kind of problem, right? So how can we deal with inferences? How can we deal with predictions? Should there also be something like a right for an individual to say, no, I don't want to have this data used to be making predictions of ourselves? In the context of the university context, this question is particularly important for students when we think about the students that we have, when they also start using Google through their whole studies. Are they then still having a space where they can fail safely? Or is the data about their learning processes that being stored for the rest of their lives, and there is never a point to reset and restore the possibilities, right? So this is the whole reconceptualization of privacy angle. There's another way to have this discussion, but I'm just asking about the time because it's a bit difficult to have a feeling for that.
5, I think we still have 5+ minutes.
All right. So very quickly, because usually, again, when you look at this from this university context also, and generally, this issue of digital sovereignty comes up, right? And also there are colleagues at the University of Amsterdam who are doing similar work that we do at the University of Groningen, and they're primarily using not the privacy and autonomy lens, but the digital sovereignty lens. And what was really interesting is if you look in the literature, so there's this very good paper from Pole and Thiel, that you really can see in the 90s, we sort of led, from an internet governance perspective, we had this cyber exceptionalism, like very liberal, right? Independence of cyberspace. Then later we moved to the multi-stakeholder world, internet governance forum, and so on. But what you really see, and they show that very nicely, is that now governments increasingly think in a polarized world, with two big actors, China, USA, and then, yeah, the question is, how big is your stake of the pie, right? But the problem is that actually, if you look deeper into what digital sovereignty means, then you see that there are only claims. It's not really clear what it means. So there are a couple of themes, like this technological sovereignty, data sovereignty, and so on. But it is very, very blurry. Nobody actually really knows what this is and how this should look like. And it is also very, very complicated, especially for the European Union, because the European Union, by its very existence, is a multilateral organization with some supranational elements at its core, right? But for an entity like this to claim sovereignty about something from a political science or from a legal perspective is really, really very difficult, not to say impossible. And we see that with very concrete example. Has anyone of you ever heard about Gaia X? Yeah, all right. So, but you're the first group that I asked this, who knows it? And I think I asked this question maybe like now 15 times in presentations. It speaks to your expertise and how much you know, but it also says something about how the European Union tries to approach this digital sovereignty and federated data infrastructure. And what is really then where really push comes to the shove is the question. So if MSN, Microsoft, and Google want to join Gaia X, what is the response?
They join.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but then I mean, there are two options, right? So the one option is to say, and that is not what they have done, to say you're American and therefore you can't, but this is what digital sovereignty as an idea also proposes. And then you say, okay, you can join, you guys, because we share the same values, right? Yeah, and this is somewhere in between. Anyways, I shared this already. We try to find ways to solve it on a level of public universities. There's also a panel in Brussels on 25th of May at CPDP, where we're going to discuss this. These are, again, the questions of the stakeholders in a university setting. And then anyways, I'm just going to mention that very briefly. What I see in my work, but this has also been presented today in the morning, is that eventually, as I mentioned, the point of trying to find these new conceptual venues is really there so that we can have new type of methodologies to being able to, build better technology by taking those values into account. All right, thank you.
This last slide is of course very interesting for me, where you can go
No, the
last slide, because that inspection is from an initiative where the guys running around Europe has done 2 case studies, has a huge board, and everybody on the board tells me, oh, we have never seen anything being done. The other EU project, I think even hasn't even done 1 case study.
That's not a new project. That's a book.
EU project.
No, it's Alessandro Mantelero who wrote a book about this.
Alessandro, okay.
But I should have mentioned, these are just examples. I'm not saying they're good or bad, right? I just see that things are emerging. And today we saw another, emerging.
What's certain inspection, if you, or maybe we can discuss, we're running out of time. What's certain inspection, what's about?
Maybe,
Yeah, sure. It's Roberto Sicari's attempt of ethical AI principles, implementation, and certification.
Okay.
And the reason why it's called Z inspection is because Roberto's last name starts with Z.
No, you're kidding.
Because Roberto Sicari's last name starts with Z.
No way.
Yeah.
So he's the big brother.
No, but he has his heart at the right space, but it's not.
I thought there was something with depth or with levels or something.
No.
I'm just, and these are 3 very different kinds of assessments,
Yeah, I think that is also the challenge to sort of find, because it's a real challenge. So let's say I need to comply with European legislation and I'm doing something with AI which involves personal data. Then I have a very practical case of having to reconcile those 2 things.
The set inspection, just value-based engineering, will help to identify what criteria are actually important for AIs to match, to comply with human rights law. But then these criteria should be tested in the context of conformity assessment, and all of that should then be redone as soon as there is personal information involved through input assessment. That's a lot from yesterday.
Exactly. What you raised before as a problem, I think, is something like the classification of data, different kinds of data, and how do we classify it, what kind of sensitivity levels do we attach. It's a discussion that we have had 10 years ago, 15 years ago in the humanitarian context, right? When we wanted to install what they call responsible data. And something that, to my regret, has not been picked up. To my regret, because obviously I was shouting it very loudly, but the needs of the moment were greater than thinking through it properly, was that the problem with data is its sensitivity depends extremely on its context and not on its nature. The nature is shifting by its context. I'll give you an example with location data. It's a wonderful example because it's so variable. If you are buried under rubble in an earthquake, you want humanitarians to know where you are because you want to be found, and dragged out of the rubble. If you are in a humanitarian crisis of a different nature, say a political nature, and you're a refugee fleeing from Al-Shabaab, you don't want people to know where you are. If people know where you were 2 years ago on that very moment, nobody cares. But if you have longitudinal data of how often have you been at a certain space, it tells you much more about, gives you insights about the nature of your habits, etc. So classifying data, in my opinion, is a huge mistake because it takes away the context that makes it sensitive. And that I have always been pushing against that, but there is this kind of idea, specifically by engineers, that is like, oh, the nature of data is not changing, it's just data. Like what we make of it is the problem. If that is really true, then indeed we need to, then the methodologies of data sovereignty need to address the matters that are the purpose limitations that you've been identifying, not so much the nature of the data itself.
Yeah, but I think there is the problem of the time. So if you look, if you look at it on the scale of time, then on the one hand, you will never know what the data means because it depends on the context. I agree, but at the same time, at certain moments in time, you have to establish certainties for people to either have rights or for organizations to have duties or for agreeing on that it can be used for this or for that. So I think the problem is, how do you, and at the moment, this is very like labeling. So this is, we once say this is personal data and then it is for the rest of eternity, right? And that sort of limits the possibilities that we have with the technology. And to find a solution about that problem or to that problem or to do that requires a different type of approach, I think, than data protection. But the problem is, if you acknowledge that as a data protection lawyer, it will result in people throwing it out of the window and not taking it serious anymore. And that undermines that, for instance, there are around 10 basic principles in data protection law. So data minimization, accuracy, purpose limitation, and so on, right? And these principles, they are there since the 1970s. So there is some truth to it that sticks, right?
No, that's not my critique. My critique is more that there is a habit of labeling, and the labels seem to be kind of, or people believe the labels are universal, but they're not, because there was a nice project in 2015 in the UK. They asked kids, what do you consider private and what do you consider public? And the answer was quite uniformly, if it's public, I put it on Twitter. If it's private, I put it on Facebook.
A question I have is it effective if we leave it to politicians and courts, or would we perhaps make more progress if we would have a labeling, as we have it now with food labeling? When the consumer database or platform was opened in Germany, it was overrun by people with complaints about all sorts of products, and companies didn't like it, so they had to change their products. I think that was pretty effective, basically, right? So we would have to empower people to put pressure on companies to respect their rights. And that might be much more effective than ticking boxes, having inspectors, setting inspectors, perhaps even to look over this. And we don't have enough courts really to take care of every single person whose rights are affected.
And I agree, but so there are two sides. So I think you actually need both things. So that's why I also put this at the end. I wanted to have more debate, so that's why I didn't discuss it a lot. But these are just seeds. That's the way how I look at it. And what we need is actually much more of this to have processes which are better in designing technology from the outset, based on a holistic vision, based on maybe something like data autonomy, right? Which is taking these into account. But at the same time, there is some value in having regulations, and that is, so what do you do? That is the answer to the question, what do you do if it goes wrong, right? So who can I go to really get a remedy for a situation where things went
I
wrong?
don't know. To be honest, I mean, I've tried in Switzerland, I've tried in Germany. The court, basically, the justice system has let me down. And
Yeah.
An interesting aspect is also in GDPR, you have privacy by design as a principle. And everybody ignores it because privacy by design would actually mean that we have decentralized architectures, that we have initiatives like My Data being rolled out everywhere, that we have, as you say, a label as an electronic exchange protocol between setting up a connection in the network, saying, okay, we comply with your expectations, this is what we can offer. And that you don't have to tick any boxes, but you have really a My Data framework, decentralized architecture, being in the digital world as you like to be with your personal data. All of those protocols already existed in the year 2000. P3P was a platform that was standardized, but the industry said, obviously, we want to have the oil, and so everything developed in a different direction.
Yeah.
And the question is whether we can at all. That's why basically I left that's what actually the reason why I left privacy, because I had the impression we know for 20 years how to build the technology, but the industry is just blocking.
Yeah. And again, I think that is also the reason why eventually it is important to move into this direction, right? And I think at the moment there is across different disciplines, at least from what I see, an increasing, and actually the popularity of interdisciplinary research also helps here. I think that there is increasingly, so how do I, for me as a lawyer, for instance, so how do I translate my lawyery stuff into things that non-lawyers can understand? And their impact assessments and the methodologies that we also use for teaching, for instance, they really help, right? Because the people get the principles, they have to think about a case, they have to be in different roles, and then something goes on. But of course, this needs to be, we need to have much more facets of that. And I mean, I look at, for instance, from my perspective, what you presented today is also very much going into this direction and trying to do this, right?
I
Yeah.
standardize the first impact assessments between Europe and the US. I standardize them for the entire RFID and O2ID industry. The reason why privacy impact assessments are in the GDPR is also largely due to the work that I did with the Commission.
Yeah.
But still, I have the impression that nobody listens. As you can even, I think we are in a crisis of law, because we even, as if we succeeded to have it in the law, everybody is ignoring. Everybody's ignoring it. Or do you know, what's your knowledge on how many projects are really evaluated with privacy impact assessments? Do you have any data on that by chance? What was the effect of that law?
No, but I think I mentioned before, and that's also what you see, so the enforcement in Europe happens on a national state level, and all of the authorities complain that they have not enough resources. And so that's why I said before, I think our job as academics, or at least people like me, is to keep thinking conceptually, but at the same time, we have to emphasize that the things that we have merit. They're not perfect, but they have merit, and we need to invest more in trying to get them enforced. Yet at the same time, it is also something where this becomes political very quickly, right? It's not substantively whether it is right or wrong, but it's more like, why can't it? And but there are also positive steps. So for instance, actually in that sense, although I question generally the value of having digital contact tracing apps, because I think they're just flawed from the promise. But what was very interesting in making them privacy safe, so to speak. And for instance, in Germany, there was a very good process also with a very thorough impact assessment, GDPR impact assessment, to try to get that right.
Yeah,
and I think these examples, they also have a value, right? But then when you talk to people, so for instance, I gave a presentation about the impact assessments to Data Protection Scholars Network, and then in the end, in the discussion, people come who work at companies and they say they just want me to, find a way around it. like formally. That's also the reason why where the law, we will just simply have to acknowledge the same with courts. They can only decide on individual cases. It is a tool which works, but it has its limits, right?
Could we use legal fact in order to find that?
Neu, also Max Schrems's NGO and our privacy lab, we have built, let's say, a successor to this P3P protocol. Yeah. And we're putting the tool out there and we're trying. And Max is on basically suing the companies that won't comply with our expressed purposes, that we express them digitally through our devices. And this is a battle that's fought right now.
Kind of lawfare.
But the
Yeah.
thing is, even if you have such a wonderful little tool doing the protocol exchange and purpose limitation expression in digital way, and you have somebody like Max Schrems who has now won 2 or 3 big court cases against Facebook and so on. Then Facebook says, okay, we've lost, no? And then what? Nothing.
Yeah, the commission.
So
Yeah.
so there's a massive failure, I think, in our legal system. And
now there's a solution in that science fiction. If you read it to the end. Anyway, thank you very much.